Okay. I don't know if anybody else is coming, but they're late. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, all right. This is our final presentation for the St. Thomas festivities. And remember where we've been. Always a good way to start off. 2 weeks ago we looked at Thomas's life, and we tried to put him, within a context, the context of his age, of all the things that are going on in that time. Right on through, tracing his movements and his activities as best we can over the space of 800 years, until the time of his death. Now, I want to pick up from that point today, because today we're going to be looking at not just the man and what he did, and all of the the purely historical, biographical things, but what made him into the saint that he would become. And to do that, though, we need to pick up a little bit, back before that point, because that got a little bit of short shrift last time. We were kind of pressed for time, and I was rushing at the end. So I rushed over the most dramatic parts. So let's think back a bit. A good place to start would be the time of St. Thomas's, well, we shouldn't be calling him saint yet, he's not. The time of Thomas's return from that second stint at the University of Paris, his return to Italy, what's going to turn out to be his definitive return to Italy, the place where he started. I think we've got a nice little exitus ready to us here, Thomas comes forth from Italy, goes and does all these things, and then returns at the end of his life. I think there's a certain little significance to that. The time of his return to his native country, and in fact, right to the very place where he had his roots, right around the very place where he was born. The place where he died is just a few short miles from the place where he was born, not very far at all. I'd like to pick up with that time, because that is a time when Thomas has already accomplished more than most human beings can accomplish in a long lifetime. He's done it all in under 50 years. And he has settled in this what's going to turn out to be the last year of his life, the last full year of his life, back in Naples, back amid all those familiar surroundings, back among all of his friends and neighbors, his family. They'll all still be around. Back among all those people who have learned over the course of these years that Thomas is one of the greatest assets that their province possesses, someone who has in his life done more than anyone could ever have expected any man, a single individual, to do in the service of his order, in the service of the church at large, in the service of the quest to come to know the truth and to live it. So let's pick up with him here. He is still working, although apparently now at a slower pace, to those people around him in his house at San Domenico in Naples. He seems well, a little tired, as you can well imagine he would be. He's still producing, though. still writing, still trying to finish his great Summa Theologiae, this work that he has, his masterpiece in theology, this work that he hopes will become a standard text, encapsulating the whole of the theological project. But he's slowing down. And we find him at the end of 1273 having that experience on St. Nicholas Day, December 6th of that year, a day which I guess probably began, much like many others, Thomas arising early to say his Mass in the chapel, attended by his faithful assistant, someone we'll hear more of, Reginald of Piperno, when something happens during the course of that Mass. He is, as people said afterwards, seemed even more abstracted, more out of it, we might say, than he usually did. This experience has been attributed to many different causes. It's been attributed to exhaustion, overwork, anxieties of one sort or another. But it's been attributed to other things too. It's been attributed as well, and this is firmly a part of the Dominican tradition, to a kind of spiritual culmination in his life. This experience, you remember how afterwards he refused even to pick up his pen to continue working, in spite of the proddings of Reginald saying, Thomas, you really need to get back to work. You need to focus yourself and finish the project that you're working on. It's important. Everyone's waiting for it. And Thomas keeps telling him, no, I can't. And when Reginald presses the issue, it's almost like Thomas for a moment even kind of loses patience with him and says, I cannot continue, because after what I have seen, what has been revealed to me, everything I have done seems just like so much straw. Now, attribute all this to whatever you want. Attribute it to overwork or anxiety or a mental breakdown even, as some people have tried to make the case for. But I think a better way to take it is as simply a sign that he is now ready to leave this world. But, well, duty calls from time to time. This is the beginning of December 1273. Around the beginning of February of 1274, Thomas gets a call from the Pope, a summons to once again come to the church's service. A great ecumenical council is being held in Lyon, in France. There are all sorts of important business on. There's all sorts of important business on the table. All sorts of things that have to be done. We need you. We need your expertise. We need your theological advice. And so Thomas, as he's done so many times when called upon by those in authority over him, slowly packs up his bags and gets ready to set out. This is the beginning of February, 1274. As I think I said the last time around, he doesn't really get very far. Setting out from Naples, he starts making his way north through all that old same familiar countryside, past all those familiar landmarks. But around the middle of that month, and you can imagine we're moving kind of slowly here, Thomas is tired. He's visibly not up to this trip, really. How he's traveling, well, Dominicans traditionally walk, and he has no doubt over the course of his life put in several thousand miles walking around Europe Perhaps, given his condition, he's riding on a donkey or something like that. But in any case, progress is going to be slow. It'd be pretty cold and miserable, probably. Middle of February. That's not a good time to be out hiking the roads, especially when the roads aren't very much to speak of. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. The weather is probably not doing him very much good on this trip either. Around the middle of that month, been on the road for like 2 weeks, he has that famous little accident when, as the story is told to us, in one of his usual distracted moods, he doesn't notice this tree limb hanging over the road. Maybe it's just about so high, you know. And he hits it, or it hits him. It hits him hard. Now, whether he's on foot or whether he is perhaps on a donkey or something like that, he's described as being, stunned, if not knocked out entirely out of his senses. He's at least stunned and has difficulty getting up. A serious blow to the head. He's asked if he's all right. And he says, well, yeah, I'm all right. But clearly he's not. Here's a man who was not in good health when he set out. And now with this, his health isn't getting any better. They stop. He and his little caravan stop for about 2 weeks at a castle in a little town called Maenza, just a few miles off the road. It happens to be the home of his niece, Francesca, the Countess, and her husband. They are the lords of the manor, and they probably haven't seen very much of him for a while now. He takes this little break to try and recover. But he's clearly now getting worse and worse. His niece is alarmed at his condition. Asks Reginald, what's going on? What's up with Uncle Thomas? He's not well, is he? And sure enough, he's not, and he seems to know it. He declares finally around the end of the month that if indeed the Lord is coming to take him to himself, it would be better if he didn't find him in a castle. It would be better if he found him in a religious house. There's that little stubborn streak in Thomas coming out again, Much as he has, I'm sure, much as he has appreciated this little break, this little visit with his niece, talking about old times, maybe, if you can get a word out of him. He knows it's time to move on. Some people have already been to visit him, including some of the monks from the Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova, just a few more miles down that side road, heading toward the coast. He will go and spend some time next with them. He's received very hospitably and charitably of the old monastic tradition of receiving guests and pilgrims, especially one as distinguished as this. We're told that the monks took very good care of him. They fussed all over him to make him feel comfortable, to make him feel at home. And in many ways, it seems, Thomas did feel right at home. Once again, he's back to where he started, back to those years that he spent in childhood at the Abbey at Monte Cassino. He's back in that old familiar atmosphere, the monastic routine, where you can start to leave the world behind and start to and set your sights on the new life to come. But he's not going to be here very long either. It's here at Fossanova that on March 7th, he will pass from this world. With all of the monks gathered around him, dictating, again, we're told, at their insistence, giving them a few little talks on the Song of Songs. We don't know if that part's true or not. That might be just more of the legend that has grown up around it all, because he certainly wasn't writing anything more at that point. You know, maybe he did give them a little extempore conference on the Song of Songs, maybe, who knows. But it says something about where he sees himself going next. He dies on March 7th, and the funeral apparently took place 2 days later. A number of people come for this. Some of his brethren make the trip up from Naples. Some other people from roundabout come to the event. His niece Francesca will come down from Maenza. She's not allowed into the cloister for the formal viewing of the body, but as a favor to her, they bring the body out to the monastery gates so she can have one last moment of communion with her uncle. And a lot of people just come from roundabout. A lot of the peasants from the fields. He's, after all, he's one of them too. They come because they perhaps heard a little something about this great man. And they too want to pay their respects. The funeral mass, which is preached by Reginald, his faithful companion, a man who has been his secretary and traveling companion and personal assistant for about 15 years now. Yeah, he's somebody who's been assigned to Thomas as, you know, an official helper. So there's probably nobody else in the world who knows him better than Reginald. You know, Reginald is the man who serves his mass in the morning. Reginald's the man who hears his confessions. Reginald is the man who takes his dictation, keeps track of all of his important papers and things. Probably nobody in the world knows him better than Reginald. Reginald preaches the funeral and is visibly moved when he speaks of his longtime friend. The sources also tell us that immediately from the very day of the funeral, there are reports of miracles, healings of one sort or another. Beginning, I think, even before the funeral takes place, when Thomas is simply laid out, one of the monks who is, you know, suffering from, you know, eye trouble, they bring him down and they, you know, kind of lay him down across on top of the body, and he receives a cure. More of this takes place around the time of the funeral and afterwards. Now, it's easy to see from all this that we have on the table all the pieces that are necessary for the beginnings of a popular cult. Thomas is seen by these people who know him at least by his reputation, even if not personally. He's known to them as a great man, a man with an international reputation for learning and service to the church. But he's not just a mind. They also see him as someone who is clearly a saint, a devout religious, a man with possessed of a kind of childlike purity, which he's had since he was himself a child. a humble man of prayer who has been favored now with extraordinary revelations, and who has now returned to them to die a holy death among his own, whatever level of society they come from, whether they are his religious brothers, whether they are the local clergy, whether they are the monks of Fossanova, whether they are the peasants out in the fields. They're all his own. And a holy death is, by all accounts, what he showed them, confessing his faith in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist that he has loved all his life, and submitting all of his labors, whatever they're worth in his eyes, to the judgment of the Church. That's the way a saint ought to go out of this world. And that's what Thomas does. All right, now, as I've said already, a key figure in the dissemination of this cult is Reginald of Piperno. Piperno is also just up the road, a couple of miles. You can walk from Fossanova. I've done it. You can walk from Fossanova up to Piperno in an hour. You know, it's no problem at all if you don't get run down by some car speeding around a curve. They're all his own. They know him. He knows them. They love one another. They share in a common faith. Reginald is going to, because of his long experience every day, day in, day out with Thomas for all these years, it's Reginald who's going to be the ultimate source of many of these intimate details we have of Thomas's daily life, his interior life. And he, in turn, is going to pass on what he knows. It's he who's going to inspire a number of, in these days, still young Dominicans who have been associated with Thomas during the time that he spent in Naples, who have perhaps sat in on his lectures. He's going to inspire a number of these people, and we've met them already, the authors of some of these biographies of Thomas that begin to appear, with a desire to go out and collect material to show their hero, their model, someone whom they respect and admire, someone whom they, too, have come to love in whatever way. These are the people who are going to serve to perpetuate that cult. And again, we've met several of them already. Last time somebody mentioned the name William of Tocco. Okay, he's one of those biographers. He's one of the people who is resident in Naples in those days. He's the one who hears some of these stories from. Well, let's see, does he hear them direct from Reginald, or does he hear them secondhand from Reginald? But he hears them, and Reginald's the source. He's going to be the author of what is probably the most complete and reliable of these biographies. And he will appear later on, much later on, when he is himself an old man. He'll appear again as the official promoter of the canonization process, building on all the things that he has learned, all the little tidbits that he has picked up from members, from older friars who knew Thomas better than he did, from members of Thomas's family, all still living around the neighborhood. So a cult is already starting within days of his death and burial, as the news gets around. Now, this is part of the reason why we venerate St. Thomas as we do, because of his all these saintly attributes. But there is, of course, because he is St. Thomas, there is that other side of his personality too, that other side of his that other side of the example that he presents to the world, and that is his intellectual work. His work as a theologian, as a student of this, as a student of divine revelation, as a teacher, employing all the resources that are at his disposal to come to know the truth of God better. That's the other side of his holiness. But here, well, Thomas's teachings are still at this moment, the time of his death and the immediate aftermath, are still rather controversial. And here too, we've got to back up a little bit. Back up to the time of Thomas's last teaching stint in Paris. He arrived there, you might remember from 2 weeks ago, he arrived there in the middle of a great controversy, the so-called Averroist controversy, a controversy that's been provoked by some of the philosophers over in the Faculty of Arts, who in their, well, perhaps over-enthusiastic embrace of Aristotle, present a challenge to anybody with a traditional view of what the Catholic faith is, what truth is, because they will come to maintain that what can be arrived at purely by reason, the way Aristotle did it, without benefit of revelation, can be just as true as something that is revealed. Here's something, again, that we perhaps think of as a modern problem, you know, the dichotomy between faith and reason. We think of that as a modern problem. Well, it was a problem back then in the 13th century, too. And it was a problem that the Christian world was dealing with for the very first time. This radical brand of Aristotelianism, almost pagan kind of approach to truth, often found itself at odds with revealed truth as maintained in the theology faculty or as maintained by the ecclesiastical authorities who regulate the university and its affairs. This is the problem that St. Thomas walks right into when he goes back to Paris in 1266. And although, again, to reference back to 2 weeks ago, although Thomas tries to steer a middle course between these guys on one hand and on the other, the traditionalists, who have come to a conclusion themselves that if this is where Aristotle leads, we don't want any part of him. Thomas had come to know Aristotle way back in his own university days in Naples, when he was just a teenager, and he never lost his respect for him. And even people who are now, in his view, misusing him, who are allowing these who are allowing themselves to be influenced too much by a purely natural approach to reason, who are perhaps allowing a little too much to the insights of pagan and infidel commentators. Thomas can't bring himself to part with truth as revealed. Never could, never could. He tries to steer a middle course here to preserve the unity of faith, to preserve the unity of truth. Truth, after all comes from one source. It all comes from the one God. How can they be leading us in two different directions? How can the truth of reason be leading us away from what is revealed to us? And how can revealed truth advance beyond simple yes, I believe, unless it's ready to listen to what reason says, to help us understand it for what it really is. Nevertheless, in this polemical atmosphere, pitting the arts faculty against the theologians, pitting the university, at least part of the university, against the church authorities, pitting Franciscans, many Franciscans against Dominicans. Here's the beginnings of some real animosity between these two groups, which are so much alike in so many ways. Here are the beginnings of it, and we may, in fact, even hear a little echo of all of this. Well, let's say this: here are the beginnings of trouble, because these things tend to cast a little shadow over St. Thomas. There are people who are at least on the verge of accusing St. Thomas of being not orthodox, because he holds certain Aristotelian principles, but he holds them in a way that's quite different from others. Nevertheless, if Aristotle becomes the enemy to the traditionalists, well, then Thomas is for Aristotle. Well, we're not so sure about him. Thomas, remember too, had long had problems with the university. He had problems when he first turned up there, getting accepted onto the faculty, gaining the rights that belong to someone who had jumped through all the hoops and done all the things they were supposed to have done. After Thomas has left Paris and returned to Italy, he can maybe put some of that behind him, but it's also going to follow. He was in the thick of this controversy, writing treatises directed now at one side and treatises now directed at the other, to try and keep everything in a nice harmonious balance. But it doesn't really do him a whole lot of good. Immediately after Thomas's death, here's a place where we can maybe hear a little echo of the controversies that are still raging back in Paris in Thomas's absence now. It's no more than about 2 months after Thomas's death. The university in Paris has now heard about that, and there's a request from the arts faculty, the philosophers, to the master of the Dominicans, asking that Thomas be brought to Paris and buried there with them. There's maybe a little hint there that they too see him as more for us than against us. No, they were still hanging in the air. Right, it's not resolved in his lifetime. So here, he's just died, and the philosophers in Paris are petitioning to have Thomas brought to Paris and buried with them. What does that say? That says they see him almost as he's one of us too. He's for Aristotle. What did they think over in the theology faculty about that? Opinion may have been a bit mixed. things are going to start sorting themselves out in Paris already in 1270. In 1270, the Bishop of Paris condemns a little list of what he calls Averroist propositions, erroneous propositions coming from the philosophy faculty, some of which, only a couple, now these are the topics are all very abstract, and to us moderns who are not accustomed to that way of speaking or thinking are going to say, what's all the fuss about? What is the real issue underneath all these condemnations? But some of them could have been read at the time as touching on Thomas as well as people who were stepping over the bounds of orthodoxy, because they're principles that he himself would have been willing to defend, or at least would have been willing to make some important distinctions about. Right? There's a kind of suspicion that is still hanging over Thomas's head. In 1277, now here we're after Thomas's death, right? 1270 is a little before. He's already left Paris at that point, but the bishop seems to have the knives out for him. In 1277, the bishop issues another list, a second condemnation. And this time he's got more than a handful of propositions. He's got a whole big long list of 219 of them. Again, Thomas is not named directly as a target of these condemnations. But once again, a good number of these items are things that Thomas would have been perhaps a little sympathetic to, thought contained some kernel of truth that was worth preserving and exploring. And he could easily simply get bundled up with the enemies of traditional faith. The same bishop, yeah. And Paris isn't the only place where this is happening. So it's not just, an in-house problem at the University of Paris. There are other people elsewhere. Just shortly after this second list of condemned propositions comes out in 1277, just afterwards, there will be condemnations also coming out of Oxford University and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Two successive archbishops of Canterbury, for that matter. One of them is himself a Dominican. So at this point, not even all Dominicans agree with St. Thomas in his approach. The other, a Franciscan, who's already, kind of prejudiced against anything that comes from a Dominican. Okay, well, be that as it may. Thomas's long-term reputation as a teacher is at risk here. But what will come to his aid is that whole generation of people that he has formed, maybe even two generations at this point. People who were themselves his own students in his own Dominican studia classrooms. People who learned who St. Thomas was and what he thought directly from him. Or, maybe at one further remove, those people for whom Thomas had organized that program of studies, which was intended to govern the whole order and its intellectual formation program. They will kind of rally round to defend their great teacher, someone whom they themselves will increasingly see as the greatest contribution of our community to the greater good of the church. A tradition that they had themselves been formed in, they will now rally to his defense. And the controversy will go on for half a century. Almost. Reginald? Well, Reginald's going to be out of this pretty quickly. You know, I suppose Reginald probably would have, he certainly would have sympathized with his master's plight, but he's not one of the people leading the charge. The people leading the charge are the people in the university chairs. He'd be younger. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose he's younger. I think he died somewhere around 1290 or something like that. You know, I think of Reginald anyway. Reginald is not a university man by training or vocation. He's there. He's an important person. Just having a job like that as an assistant to, you know, the great professor, that's important in its own right. He knows, you know, how the university system works and all that stuff, but he's not, you know, the master teaching from his chair. Those are the people who are going to be arguing about the doctrinal points. Reginald is going to be busy kind of getting the cult, both within the order and at large, off the ground as the source of so many of those stories. It's not going to be, in fact, until after Thomas is canonized that his reputation will be fully cleared. Canonization, well, we're coming to that in a moment. He's canonized in 1323. It's not until 1325 that the then Bishop of Paris formally revokes that long list of condemnations, quote, insofar as they may have touched or seemed to touch upon the teaching of Blessed Thomas. You know, after the guy's canonized, you can't say anything about him being unorthodox anymore. Oh yeah, yeah. We're 50 years down the road. But that settles the whole business. You know, Thomas can now be held up by his supporters, the generations now of Dominicans who have been trained according to Thomas's principles, according to Thomas's order of presentation. They can now hold him up as the model theologian. Well, the arts people are going to run into, you know, more. They're the ones who are more at risk now. If they say anything that's too far out of line, that smacks too much of paganism, people will be much quicker now to step on them. But you can't step on St. Thomas anymore after this. Yeah.
Why do so many sources classify this condemnation of these propositions as an excommunication?
Well, because that's what would have been attached to it. If you weren't prepared to retract those opinions, you'd be up against the possibility of excommunication. Well, he was never formally excommunicated. He was never even formally named. Some people were named. You know, Thomas is never named, but there's this little insinuation. You know, and people. No. He was. He was never excommunicated, but he was in he was under suspicion, let's say, right? At least in certain quarters, he was under suspicion of being just another one of these radical Aristotelians who was out to pit human reason against divine revelation. And say, well, revelation may be true, but reason tells me this. You know, the separation of the two. Thomas would never have accepted any such concept. That would have been an impossibility for him. That truth, that you could have two kinds of truth. You know? Oh, sure. Well, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this is, you know, God gave us brains and expects us to use them. It's not just a matter of saying, you know, credo in unum Deum. What does that mean? You know? And if you use your brains to explore what that means, what all the tenets of our faith mean, you will end up knowing God a whole lot better than you would if you're simply repeating formulas, you know. But don't think that that can ever be a substitute, you know, for revelation, because there are limits beyond which our human reason cannot go. Thomas is always aiming for the happy medium there. He's willing to learn from any source. He's not afraid of anything. You know, what's true is true, and it's up to me to figure out how things which, you know, think of the whole scholastic method. Yeah, think of the whole scholastic method in which you propose an idea and then people raise their objections to it. Objections which are reasoned, which are based upon revelation, which are based upon all kinds of things. You, as the master, you have to sort all that out. You have to show how what Scripture says, for instance, in one place, and what Scripture says in another place is just the opposite. You have to show how they're not really opposite at all, that there are different ways in which you should understand that truth. But they're not in opposition to one another, they're not in conflict with one another. Thomas tries to keep that. And ends up often getting dumped on by both sides. All right, well, all right, that sort of stays his reputation, at least in the order. You know, other schools of thought will still continue. You know, the Franciscan school, following on Bonaventure, and the people who followed after Bonaventure later on, are going to have a whole different approach to theology from Thomas and the Dominican tradition. Well, they're in different varieties. You know, you got brown Franciscans, black Franciscans, gray Franciscans. You know, you got all kinds. Oh man, there's more Franciscans around you can shake a stick at. Dominicans and Franciscans have been at each other, you know, ever since the beginning, almost. You know, Dominicans and Franciscans back in the beginning, in the days of the founders, they're simply two sides of the same coin. They're both people who want to respond to the needs of the age, reviving the ideals of the apostolic life, but in different ways, with a different focus. Dominicans emphasize the preaching aspect. Franciscans emphasize the poverty aspect, the preaching by example aspect. They have a different take on the same idea. And in the early days, they both had to fight just to survive, because people looked at this new kind of religious life and said, who are these guys? You know, don't they know that monks are supposed to stay in their monasteries? That monks are supposed to support themselves and not sponge off the public? Don't they know that they're supposed to be living an orderly life and not wandering around the countryside? That's what both groups were doing. They both had to defend themselves, but they had some influential protectors, most notably the popes, people like Innocent III, who saw a gold mine in these two groups. Didn't live long enough to see them all come to fruition, but who certainly encouraged them in their earliest days. People like Honorius III, who confirmed the Dominicans, gave them their final signed, sealed, and delivered, and also did the same. Also did the same for the Franciscans. Sort of nursing them through the process of coming up with constitutions that will actually work. Last thing Francis had on his mind. He didn't care about stuff like that. The popes backed both orders to the hilt. It was due to papal support that that Thomas and Bonaventure, both, contemporaries, actually got those teaching positions at Paris, because the university then wanted to keep them out, or an important faction in the university wanted to keep them out. But as time goes on, as the theological differences become deeper and theological squabbling becomes more bitter, and that's part of what's going on here in this crisis time. Because the Dominicans, well, as we've seen, Dominicans can be seen by people as allying with the philosophers by buying into Aristotle as much as they were. Rightly or wrongly, they could be seen that way. On the other side, the Franciscans are much more naturally going to lean toward a traditional approach to doctrine, depending on the great master Augustine himself, and aren't so much for all this newfangled smarty stuff at the university. This plus once you start heading in different directions, then everything becomes an issue. Poverty is going to be a big issue. Franciscans are death on anything, no ownership of anything, zero. And the reason why we have so many different kinds of Franciscans around today is because every 50 years or so there's another big war among the Franciscans about the interpretation of poverty. Split off, down through 800 years worth of it. Dominicans had always made allowances for not exactly ownership, but they would allow somebody like Thomas to have books because he needs them. They would allow people to request money for legitimate expenses because they needed it for the sake of their mission. Franciscans could never compromise on that. Brickbats fly through the centuries, and much of it goes right back to these days. This is where it all gets started, when Dominicans and Franciscans, who had once, Bonaventure and Thomas had stood shoulder to shoulder against the University of Paris to get their rights. But afterwards, their followers are going to part company, and things are just going to go from bad to worse. As Father Simon Tugwell, one of our great historians, I've sat across the table from him for years at the refectory at the Angelicum, used to say, people go on and on about Dominicans versus Jesuits. Says, let's not forget who the real enemy is, the Franciscans. Right? All goes back to these days. It's unfortunate. It's not very edifying. Sometimes the two groups came to blows in the streets about this. The monasteries, the friars would all pile out of their houses into the streets and have a brawl, in which people sometimes got killed. Certainly not very edifying. But hey, it's the Middle Ages still, Okay, so Thomas survives, right? While his popular cult is growing, from the little nucleus of people gathered there the day of Thomas's funeral, to the Dominican province of the Roman province of the Dominicans. That's Thomas's province. He's going to be the hero. He's going to be the person we all look to. He's going to be the person whose theological opinions we're going to defend, and defend to the death if necessary. While the cult is growing, while those biographies are being written and circulated, while the legend grows all around it, there's also the slugging matches in all the schools of Europe over the extent to which we can or can't use Aristotle and his non-Christian commentators. Thomas is clearly of the opinion that there's a lot in there that's useful, that we can put to use, that we can assimilate, and it will help our understanding of who God is and how the world works. And it's good, you know. But don't ever get the idea that you can split off the truth that reason can discover from the truth that is revealed to us by God. The two of them are supposed to. The one guides the other. One enlightens the other. You know, they're not at odds. Here's something that people could learn a lot from Thomas today. You know, all these people who wring their hands about, you know, faith and reason. You know, the wedge between faith and reason, and what are we going to do? I think they should. I think a lot of them ought to look to Thomas and say, try seeing a little good in the people you see as your enemies, and maybe we'll get someplace. Maybe we'll all get someplace. Okay, let's see. The canonization. I mentioned the word, right? As you know, marking the end of any more questions about Thomas's basic orthodoxy. The canonization puts the seal on that. You can't say that sort of thing about a man who has been officially, formally canonized by the Pope. Where did the move for canonization come from? Probably it came from the Italian Dominicans. They're the ones who've been pushing the cult for some time now, for 50 years now. But the Pope, at this time, Pope John the 22nd, residing now in Avignon in France, what's now France, was then papal territory. He's one of the popes during that long period when the papacy basically packed up and moved lock, stock, and barrel from Rome to Avignon. He's not the first. He's the second, I think. They're going to be there for like 40 years. It's all kind of an accident, but it's an accident becomes, it certainly looked for a while like it was going to become permanent. The Pope, John XXII, who's a pretty forceful character and has a number of projects that he wants to work on, which might tie in with this. The Pope is certainly favorably inclined right from the get-go. He appoints a commission to start collecting materials to present to the Holy See as part of an official process for canonization. Who's the man he taps for this? Our old friend William of Tocco, who has been doing this informally now for years, and who is now given the task of officially spearheading this project and being what we would now call the promoter of the cult. That would be the year 1317. The first kind of open court session, let's say, the first actual sit-down inquiry by the members of the commission, calling witnesses, taking testimony, takes place in Naples in 1319. It lasts for 8 weeks. They call a total of 42 witnesses. Now, okay, we're 50 years down the line here, we're pushing 50 years down the line since Thomas's death. Only 12 of those 42 had actually known Thomas personally, but the others had information that they had learned from other people who did know him personally. So some people can give first-hand testimony, things that they themselves remembered. Other people could give, well, pretty good second-hand testimony. Well, yeah. I guess they'd have been very young at the time, like William himself, like that whole little first generation of Dominican hagiographers. There'd be still some people around who had known him. All right, so this, here's an 8-week session. A whole little papal court of inquiry is assembled in Naples to take all this testimony. And it's all recorded. You could go to the Vatican archives, I suppose, and look it all up. It's all there. And this is where we hear a lot of the same stories that are preserved for us in the biographers. A lot of the stories which have, well, maybe grown a little bit in the telling over those years, but it's all there. This is what people remembered. This is what people told the papal commissioners. 2 years later, 1321, there's a second inquiry. This one is not so in depth, not going into all the Thomas's whole life story. It's confined solely to an investigation of all those many, and by now there are many, reports of miracles. It's held at Fossa Nova, the place where Thomas died. But they're in and out pretty quick. This session only lasts like 10 days. In 10 days, though, they managed to hear from 112 witnesses. These are people of all sorts, although largely they are lay people. Some, from up the social ladder a little bit, but many are simply the local peasantry. People who, as it's all taken down solemnly by the secretaries there, people who couldn't read or write, people who weren't quite sure how old they were. They didn't know much of anything. But they knew, each one of them, in one way or another, through their little brush with holiness, they knew what that power was. And it was something that they sensed in Thomas. They had all received little miracles. They had all heard of other people who had received little miracles. And they describe all these things for the commissioners. Here's the real success of that cult-building activity. All of those people that St. Thomas would have considered to be his people, all of them, are united in their opinion that Thomas was a holy man. The canonization itself, canonization didn't take too long in those days. They went through pretty quickly for the most part. Now they can get stretched out for centuries. But back then, didn't take long at all. From the first inquiry or from the appointment of the commission in 1317, the canonization takes place on July 8th. The canonization ceremony takes place on July 18th, 1323. So 6 years. It's held at Avignon, the papal residence. The Pope is settling in there for the long haul, before a whole host of notables, Dominican notables, local notables. Even the King of Sicily is there in person, because he's one of our own too. All right, so here he is now, officially canonized, a saint. Must have made the Dominicans very happy. William of Tocco didn't quite live to see it. He died before the process came to an end. But he could see it coming. Probably made the Franciscans, probably outraged the Franciscans. Probably outraged a few other people around here who still had their lingering doubts about this man. But there it is. He is now a saint, and there's no contesting it. This is going to be followed now. Here we really get into his posthumous reputation, his posthumous career, as I called it in the little blurb, because one pope after another is going to throw his 2 cents into this, issue some kind of an endorsement of Thomas. A couple of notable stops along the way, over centuries now. It seems like every other pope has got something good to say about St. Thomas that was worth remembering and noting down and filing away in the archives. Few highlights along the way. In 1567, he is named a doctor of the church. This is significant in itself because he's the first man to break into that select crowd since anybody started even thinking about doctors of the church. Who are the 4 traditional doctors of the Latin church? Jerome? No, too late. Too late. Jerome, they're all from the fathers. Jerome, Augustine, Ambrose, and Gregory the Great. Right? Nobody later than the year 600. Thomas is named a doctor of the church in 1567. He's number 5. That's certainly a seal of approval. And that's the work of Pius V. Well, Pius V, Dominican Pope, holding up the side, If anybody's going to boost Thomas's reputation and status, it's going to be Pius V, who has already discovered, the utility of Thomas's teachings, because that's what got us through the Council of Trent. It's said, again, I think this is kind of legendary, but it's said that the Council Fathers at Trent, when they set about their business, wanted a couple of things placed right there on the altar to let the world know what it is we stand for. The Bible, the decrees of the popes, and the Summa Theologiae. Now, that may be a legend, but it says a lot. Because in fact, the doctrine of St. Thomas really did get the church through that rough patch when Protestantism, the spread of Protestantism, seemed unstoppable. Another landmark along the way takes us down to the year 1879, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Aeterni Patris, recommending a revival, a thorough revival, a sweeping revival of teaching in the Thomistic tradition. A lot of people have gotten bogged down in handbooks, Catholic theology made easy. Just look up page 54, and there it is. There's the answer to your question. Leo XIII wanted to see some life put back into this project, and recommends the teaching of St. Thomas, and wants it based on good texts. Leo also established the official commission in the order devoted to producing definitive texts of all of Thomas's works. And that means, going through all the manuscripts, going through all the printed editions, collating, driving yourself mad or blind with this painstaking work to establish what it was that St. Thomas really said, because it's only by knowing what he really said that you can determine what he really thought. But since we are so convinced that what he really thought is something that's going to be of enduring value, if you want to start reviving Catholic theology, there's the place to go. It's this endorsement that really begins a process of that really guides the emergence of the so-called neo-Thomism of the late 19th and into the 20th century, which has given us all kinds of famous people. And one more, and here's yet another, Thomas's greatness affirmed from yet